I think we all know by now, or are at least aware in passing, of the controversy that has been swirling around our public school board here in the region after a teacher appearing as a delegation before the school board's board of trustees back in January was unable to complete her presentation because she was cut off. The video of that meeting, in fact, still doesn't exist online anywhere. It's been scrubbed from the internet, and the case is now in litigation. The teacher has launched a lawsuit. The board has launched, and its chair has launched a statement of defense. And here we are still discussing what began as a conversation around age-appropriate material in public school libraries. But there really is a whole lot more to this story than just that. As I said, this goes back many months now, and I think we're all at least generally aware of it. So it was with no small amount of interest that I noticed last week a student trustee with our Waterloo Region District School Board decided to wade into the conversation via social media. And that student trustee, Kenzy Soror, joins us this morning to talk about it. Kenzy, good morning.
Good morning, Larry.
What was it that led you to decide at this point last week to kind of wade into this conversation?
Right. So thank you for that question. I would just like to add on a little bit more about what you said.
Sure.
So, yes, on January 17th, the WRDSB had a meeting where a delegate spoke about the age appropriateness of some books in our libraries. And I think it's important to note that there's a mechanism in place at the board that regularly reviews our library books and makes decisions about them. And because this is a continuous and iterative process, everyone has the right to raise their concerns. But being a person of color myself and from a racial, religious, and ethnic minority background, I'm no stranger to alienization and marginalization. And while I understand that sometimes this might not be intentional, the harm does remain the same. So I was dismayed when a completely appropriate discussion, whether one would agree with it or not, progressed to this area, as I saw part of it being harmful to the student body, especially those in the LGBTQ plus community. And so going back to your question, in the aftermath of that meeting, as you mentioned, the board saw it fit not to post its recording, or that actually of the following meeting that had a lot of pro-LGBTQ plus delegations who did an excellent job in explaining exactly what the problem was. And in my opinion, this did little to limit exposure to content deemed harmful and instead created a void that caused two major problems. First, it left students who were searching on their own open to way more harmful anti-LGBTQ plus narrative as they find clips and snippets of the video, and it also left many grown-ups completely oblivious to what was actually harmful about the discussion. And instead, all these discussions turned into political arguments, and every time one of these discussions was opened, in my opinion, it added more harm to the LGBTQ plus community, staff, and students who are already vulnerable and marginalized. And so as I saw all of this happening around me, I felt like it was time for me to put out something that included all the information about the meeting, add on top of that extra context that I felt was missed during these conversations, and my overall take as a student representative, and someone who's there attending the meeting.
So to that end, Kenzy, would it be fair to say that you are speaking out as an advocate for those more vulnerable and marginalized?
Yes, 100%. That's what I'm hoping to do by raising this awareness, because I've been hearing a lot from students every time this discussion is reopened. And a lot of them aren't feeling seen or heard when it comes to these discussions, and that, again, it's more just like a political debate at this moment. So I wanted to be there for them and help put them center in the conversation, because in the end, that's what this is about. It's about a delegation that's related to students and schools.
So as a student trustee, obviously you were in attendance at that meeting back in January, and you have detailed you've detailed very well in a lengthy Twitter thread your concerns with what transpired in that meeting. Can you share with us what the harms were that you identified during that meeting.
Right. So I actually started receiving messages from concerned students even before the meeting had ended. And the harm really comes down to many students feeling like their existence was being invalidated and their struggles trivialized. So because students are watching and they are aware and they were concerned at the time and they continue to be concerned now, it's still so prevalent amongst the student body. And what I think is even more problematic is the anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment that tends to get stirred up with these discussions and the effect it has on students, staff, and families who are a part of that community.
Are you concerned at all about the age appropriateness of books in public school libraries?
Well, generally speaking, age appropriateness of books is something that we should all be concerned with to make sure that our libraries are safe and appropriate spaces. But I do want to stress that, in my opinion, the content of the delegation was not the problem, but that this content was delivered in such a way that many students did deem harmful. As for the two books that were mentioned in the delegation specifically, and having read them both, I'm not actually concerned about their age appropriateness. I didn't find the language in either one of the two books graphical, and these books talk about characters who are the same age as senior elementary students being put in situations that senior elementary students might go through. Looking at last year's WRDSB census, for example, there are students in all grades that indicated they neither identify as female nor male, and regardless of how little that number may be, these students do exist, and they deserve to see themselves and their experiences represented in their libraries. And not every student is the same, and those different from us will not simply cease to exist if we don't read about them in library books.
You know, I found really interesting, Kenzy, your argument around the language that described these books as perhaps misleading, and yet they're works of fiction. So to that end, they are merely stories.
Mm-hmm.
So would it be unfair to characterize works of fiction as misleading?
Well, I do think because words do carry with them power, misleading is a very specific word that has a very specific meaning, and it means that these books were supposed to lead us somewhere, and they led us somewhere else. And so, yes, I think that as fictional books, and non-historical fiction as well, so these aren't based on history events, it's describing a story, and it's talking about fictional characters, and it's written in a way that the authors are getting across their messages. And so, yeah, I don't think that in this case it's difficult to call a piece of fiction misleading, in my opinion.
Did you have any concerns during the meeting about the presentation being stopped short? Do you think it should have been allowed to continue, or had it reached a point where you agreed that the delegation should have been stopped?
You know, this is actually a great question, Mike. And as an advocate for freedom of expression myself, I did struggle contemplating about this, but I guess without proper acknowledgement of the harm that was the reason to stop the delegation, there was no guarantee that no harm would follow if the delegation would have continued. And so at the end of the day, I believe that averting more harm should always take precedence.
Do you think the meeting should be available online for people to view and to better understand the context of all of this?
Yeah, so I understand that there may be legality issues around having the meeting up on its own, but I do think that it's important to have something there regarding the meeting and what happened, to make sure that there isn't a void that can then be filled with, again, all of this anti-LGBTQ plus sentiment. So if a video wasn't possible, I do wish that there had been something, maybe like a summary that didn't quote anything verbatim to avoid causing more harm to the community, but at the same time made sure that people are aware of what happened during this meeting.
You know, Kenzy, one of the questions I've been asking myself, and I think I've probably asked it out loud over all of these months, because I go back to a time when I was a reporter and we had the luxury of resources that I could cover school board meetings, and I would sit in on these meetings and report on the happenings and whatnot. And obviously there's been an awful lot of conversation and maybe we could even say controversy following this meeting that took place now about 7 months ago. And we continue to talk about it. And the question I keep coming back to is, what about the students? Now, you mentioned you were already receiving messages from fellow students during that meeting back in January. Has there been an impact on the school community over these many months? I mean, do students care about all of this? Are they aware of what's been going on at the board level, and does it bother them?
Right. So, yes, students are definitely aware of what's happening at the board level, and many have begun to tune into these meetings every week or as much as they can, and they get to see what's happening unfold right in front of them. So, yes, there is awareness amongst the student body of what does happen in these board meetings, and it does impact them. So something like this has a very significant impact on the students who are members of the LGBTQ plus community. Even if they weren't addressed directly, you can't help but think that where else this anti-LGBTQ sentiment might be coming from, based on these discussions, again, that it feels like we tend to stir up these anti-LGBTQ sentiments with the discussions that have been happening afterwards. And so that's something that I've been hearing from students about. And then I've also been hearing from students who aren't necessarily affected, but they want to find out what happened during the meeting, and they want to be educated on what's going on. And so it has affected them to not have had access to the things that were removed by the board.
In your role then as a student trustee, does it become your job, Kenzy, to help convey what happened in that meeting? And maybe in the absence of that video, you're answering a lot of emails and talking to a lot of people individually.
Yeah, I do think it's something that at least I feel like I really want to do, because I want to help students not just understand what happened in the meeting, but also help the students who are feeling like they are unheard, help give them a voice. And so that was the whole purpose of why I posted my thread. I wanted to put out just the information first, so people who were looking for it could find it, and then my personal take. And so I'm contributing to the discussion as a representative of the student body, and I hope that I've actually already been seeing more productive discussions in the comments of that thread, and so I hope to see that trend continue, and we're having more productive and safe conversations.
I'm really happy to hear that, because I was going to say, personally, I believe it's rather courageous of you to put out onto social media what you did. Completely understand the reasons, and that makes a whole lot of sense to me. But I wondered about the response to date and how that response has made you feel. But it's been primarily positive, you're saying? There's been a mix of both. There are some comments that aren't super positive, but and this was actually the second thread that I created in the past week about the topic. And the reason why I posted my second one was because the reactions to the first one were as politically divisive as I was concerned about. So that's why I felt the need to write a longer one that is no longer subtle, but as clear and elaborate as possible. And so that political divisiveness isn't gone yet, but I'm starting to see more just conversations between people that are respectful of each other, and, just a conversation instead of a completely political argument. Before I let you go, Kenzy, it is the Friday before the long weekend, the Labor Day weekend, the last weekend of summer. Can we talk real quick about the upcoming school year?
Of course we can.
What are your feelings going into what seems like a quote unquote normal school year, at least in terms of classroom attendance, in person, etc.? How are you feeling heading into the year?
Right. So personally, I am very hopeful that we're going to continue down this path and it's going to be as normal a year as possible. But I'm also feeling still very cautious because alongside other students, I'm recognizing that there are residues of the pandemic. And so things like health and safety precautions and trying to keep ourselves safe, that's still something that's at the forefront of every student's mind. But we're all really hoping that this year the quality of our education can be restored to pre-pandemic times safely.
When you talk about the quality of that education being restored to pre-pandemic times, what does that look like to you?
I think, well, for every student, it's going to look very different because throughout these past 2.5 years, students have had varying concerns when it comes to their education. So some have felt like they've missed content. Others have felt like they haven't been able to develop a very deep understanding of that content. And some have felt like there are things that they just didn't have the opportunity to get to, and then they need to get to that in order to be successful in their next year. So I think what success is going to look like in terms of that is every student is getting the support that they need to fulfill whatever gap happened in the past 2.5 years. And over the pandemic, I've already been seeing students helping each other. So students who might be struggling a little bit less have peer tutored and mentored students who need some more help. And so that's been phenomenal to see. And I'm hoping to see even more resources. Like we have great guidance counselors and staff who are there for students. So all of that support continuing and helping everyone bounce back from the past 2.5 years.
What does a full school experience look like to you? I mean, how important are those extracurriculars, for example?
They're definitely a very vital part in creating a school community where everyone is having fun and enjoying themselves. And since last year, where things started to open up again, you can hear this buzzing in the halls of everyone excited for their club or their sports team or the celebration that's happening soon. So that is something important to keep everyone's spirits up. But I do really want to stress that safety is a very, 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 very critical concern. And many students understand that sometimes these extracurriculars might not be possible if it means keeping themselves safe. So I think what we should prioritize is not necessarily just in-person return to school, but a safe in-person return to school.
Kenzy, you are an excellent representative for the students, and they're lucky to have you on the board. Thank you very much for joining us on the show this morning.
Thank you so much for having me, Mike.
Kenzy Soror is a student trustee with the Waterloo Region District School Board. She waded into the conversation around that meeting that we're all very well aware of from much earlier this year. Shared where she thought it was problematic, the meeting and the responses to it. The absence of video, even to this day, may not be the best thing in Kenzy's eyes, but an opportunity for her to share her message more widely, which is why she went to social media the way that she did in order to, in one place, respond to the various concerns that she had been hearing. And hey, how can you have a conversation with a student trustee heading into the last long weekend of summer without looking ahead to the school year that's about to begin next Tuesday? I know there is great anticipation in my household when it comes to that return to school. I hope the sentiment is the same in yours. This is the Mike Farwell Show on City News 570.